In the Central Archive of the Ministry of Defense of the Russian Federation, in Collection 48, Inventory 3409, File 28, a document registered under number 0428 is stored. The signing date is November 17, 1941. The time is 23:30. The document bears the signatures of the Chairman of the State Defense Committee, Joseph Stalin, and the Chief of the General Staff, Boris Shaposhnikov. This original, printed on standard sheets, has gone down in history as the directive of the headquarters of the Supreme High Command on the transition to scorched earth tactics in the rear of German troops. Before proceeding to a detailed military technical analysis of this document and the chronicle of its implementation, I ask you to subscribe to our channel. Your subscription helps develop archival research and produce large-scale historical documentary materials. To understand the prerequisites for the emergence of Directive 0428, it is necessary to analyze the operational situation on the Soviet-German front by mid-November 1941. The German Army Group Center, under the command of Field Marshal Fedor von Bock, was conducting the second stage of Operation Typhoon, with the aim of encircling and capturing Moscow. This grouping included 3 tank groups and 2 field armies, with a total personnel strength exceeding 1 million men. The offensive was conducted under conditions of critical strain on supply lines. The Wehrmacht's rear communications stretched over a depth of more than 1,000 kilometers from the main supply bases in Warsaw and Smolensk. The railway network operated at 30% of its standard capacity due to the difference in rail gauge and sabotage actions. By November 15, 1941, the air temperature in the Moscow region had dropped to -18 degrees Celsius, and the snow cover thickness reached 30 to 35 centimeters. German troops faced a lack of winter uniforms, non-freezing lubricants for weapons, and antifreeze for motor vehicles. Under these conditions, settlements became the Wehrmacht's main condition for maintaining the combat effectiveness of its personnel and equipment. The Soviet Western Front, under the command of Army General Georgy Zhukov, held the defense on lines located 60 to 80 kilometers from Moscow. The front's reserves were practically exhausted. The density of artillery fire on key axes was less than 10 guns per 1 linear kilometer of front. The General Staff of the Red Army was searching for asymmetric methods to impact the advancing enemy grouping, which could slow its pace of advance without involving large combined arms formations. The logic of the Soviet command was based on the material factors of a climatic nature. Depriving the enemy of warm shelters under the conditions of the approaching winter was considered an effective way to disable enemy manpower. The text of Directive 0428 consisted of a preamble and 4 directive parts. The preamble stated that the German army was adapted for waging war in warm conditions and had no warm uniforms. The directive part contained strict technical prescriptions. Point 1 demanded the destruction and burning to the ground of all settlements in the rear of German troops to a depth of 40 to 60 kilometers from the front line and 20 to 30 kilometers to the right and left of roads. To destroy settlements, Point 2 ordered the immediate use of aviation, artillery, and mortar fire, as well as reconnaissance teams and sabotage groups. Point 3 obliged commanders of units and formations to form special teams of hunters in each regiment, numbering 20 to 30 men, for the arson and blowing up of settlements. Finally, Point 4 demanded that the military councils of the fronts and armies systematically check the execution of this order and report to the General Staff every 3 days the exact number of destroyed villages. Immediately after the signing of the document At 0:45 hours on November 18, 1941, the headquarters of the Western Front duplicated the directive to the commanders of the 5th, 16th, 30th, 43rd, 49th, and 50th Armies. The process of forming and deploying special units began. The main burden of executing the directive fell on the Intelligence Department of the Western Front headquarters, led by Major Arturs Sprogis. Under his command operated Military Unit 9903, which served as a sabotage and reconnaissance center. Volunteers from Komsomol organizations in Moscow and the Moscow region were assigned to this unit. Their training period at the base in Javoronki lasted from 3 to 7 days. The training program included handling KS incendiary mixture bottles, installing TNT charges, compass navigation in rough terrain, and the basics of camouflage. The material and technical support for the sabotage groups of Military Unit 9903 was minimal and calculated based on foot movement deep in the enemy's rear. Each fighter was issued one PPSH-41 submachine gun with 2 drum magazines for 71 rounds, or one Mosin Nagant 3-line rifle, model 1891/1930, with 30 rounds. The primary means of executing the order were 3 to 4 bottles of KS incendiary fluid, consisting of phosphorus and sulfur dissolved in carbon disulfide. This mixture self-ignited upon contact with air after the bottle was broken. They were also issued 10 packs of windproof matches, 1 axe, 2 RG-42 or F1 hand grenades, and a 5-day food ration consisting of crackers, lard, and concentrates. The total weight of personal equipment ranged from 18 to 22 kilograms, which significantly reduced the mobility of the fighters when moving through snow deeper than 40 centimeters. The Chronicle of Tactical Actions in the Defense Zone of the Fifth Army, under the command of Major General of Artillery Leonid Govorov, shows a high intensity of the directive's application. Between November 18th and 25th, 1941, 14 sabotage groups, with a total strength of 186 personnel, were sent into the rear of the German 197th Infantry Division, which was part of the Wehrmacht's 4th Field Army. Crossing the front line was carried out at night at the junctions of the defenses of the Soviet 32nd and 50th Rifle Divisions, in the area of the settlements of Obukovo and Shalikovo. The coordinates of the crossing points were recorded in the combat logs of the Army's Intelligence Department. On November 21, 1941, a group under the command of Boris Krynov, which included Zoya Kozmodemyanskaya and Vasily Klubkov, received the task of destroying 10 settlements, including the villages of Petrishevo, Anashkino, Liakovo, and Ilyatino. The operational sector was located 25 kilometers south of the Volokolamsk Highway. Units of the 332nd Infantry Regiment of the German 197th Division were stationed in these villages, including the Regimental Communications Center and stables for 120 horses. On the night of November 27th, Kraynov's group reached the outskirts of Petrishevo. The fighters managed to set fire to 3 residential houses and 1 enemy motor vehicle. The resulting fire disrupted the wire communications between the headquarters of the 332nd Regiment and its forward battalions for 4 hours. However, during an attempt to set another fire on November 28th, Kozmodemyanskaya was discovered by a local resident performing the duties of village elder and detained by a German patrol. After interrogation, she lost her life, and her actions became an example of the full implementation of the order in official reports. Simultaneously, in the sector of the 16th Army of Lieutenant General Konstantin Rokossovsky, the destruction of populated areas was carried out by organic regimental artillery and assault aviation. On the Klinsk-Solnechnogorsk axis, the German 5th Army Corps advanced along the Leningrad Highway. The command of the 16th Army ordered the artillery regiments of the Reserve of the High Command, RGC, to conduct a fire raid on the villages of the Peshkovo and Krivtsovo defense nodes, which were already occupied by the forward units of the German 2nd and 11th Panzer Divisions. On November 23, 1941, batteries of 122 mm howitzers, model 1938, fired 480 high-explosive fragmentation shells at the populated areas of Davidkovo and Golovkovo. According to aerial reconnaissance reports, up to 60% of the buildings in Davidkovo were destroyed, which forced units of the German 2nd Panzer Division to disperse their equipment in forested areas, losing 12 vehicles to engine freezing. On the southern flank of the Moscow defense, in the sector of the 50th Army of Major General Ivan Boldin, the situation was complicated by the deep envelopment of Tula by units of the 2nd Panzer Army of Colonel General Heinz Guderian. The German 24th Motorized Corps advanced in the direction of Stalinogorsk and Venyov. Directive 0428 here was executed primarily by Army partisan detachments and blocking detachments. On November 20, 1941, the partisan detachment Peredovoy, under the command of the secretary of the Dediovsky District Committee of the All-Union Communist Party, Bolsheviks, raided the village of Dediovo, where a rear battalion of the Wehrmacht's 3rd Panzer Division was stationed. 14 residential houses adapted as barracks and a fuel and lubricants depot were destroyed. This delayed the refueling of tanks of the German 6th Panzer Regiment by 8 hours, allowing the Soviet 413th Rifle Division to occupy a defensive line on the Shat River. Moving to a critical audit of the command's decisions, it is necessary to point out the first serious discrepancy in archival sources and a planning error related to the depth and topography of the object destruction areas. The directive required conducting destruction to a depth of 40 to 60 kilometers in the enemy rear. However, analysis of reports from the Intelligence Department of the Western Front shows that the logistical condition of the groups did not allow them to penetrate further than 15 to 20 kilometers from the front line. Groups sent into the sector of the 49th Army of Lieutenant General Ivan Zakharkin in the Yukhnov area spent up to 80% of their physical strength overcoming forest debris and deep snow. The report of the Chief of the Intelligence Department of the 49th Army, dated December 12, 1941, noted that out of 18 dispatched groups, 11 failed to reach their designated objects due to frostbite and a lack of ski equipment. The groups were forced to operate in the immediate frontline zone, destroying buildings in populated areas that were in the gray zone and often used by Soviet units during counterattacks. The second discrepancy concerns the volume and effectiveness of the destruction of housing stock, according to reports from Soviet headquarters, compared to documents of the German Army's quartermaster services. In Operational Summary number 268 of the Western Front headquarters, dated November 30, 1941, it was claimed that as a result of the actions of aviation and sabotage groups in the sector of the 5th Army, 42 populated areas were completely burned and rendered unusable. At the same time, according to the billeting logs of the Wehrmacht's 4th Field Army, at the indicated coordinates, only 12 villages sustained damage that precluded the accommodation of personnel. The other 30 villages were partially damaged, and German engineering units restored surviving basements and semi-destroyed huts using local labor. Soviet sabotage groups, operating at night under intense enemy defensive fire, visually recorded the ignition of one or two buildings as the destruction of an entire populated area. This led to the General Staff being misinformed about the real extent to which the enemy was deprived of winter quarters. The third strategic planning error lay in underestimating the impact of the scorched earth tactics on the subsequent offensive operations of the Red Army itself. When developing Directive 0428, the General Staff proceeded from the concept of protracted positional defense during the winter period. However, by the end of November, planning for a large-scale counteroffensive near Moscow had already begun. When the troops of the Kalinin Front went on the offensive on December 5, 1941, and those of the Western Front on December 6, they encountered an infrastructural collapse created by their own actions. The advanced units of Lieutenant General Vasily Kuznetsov's 1st Shock Army, having driven the enemy out of Yakroma and Klin, discovered that up to 50% of the residential buildings in these settlements had been destroyed. In 30-degree frost, Soviet rifle regiments, lacking tents and field kitchens, were forced to bivouac in the open. Frostbite losses in the units of the 1st Shock Army during the first 10 days of December 1941 amounted to 1,400 people, which equaled 10% of the total sanitary losses for that period. The destroyed infrastructure slowed the pace of the Soviet advance from the standard 15 kilometers to 4 to 5 kilometers per day. Assault groups lost strong points for warming up, and rear motor columns could not use burned villages to organize intermediate supply bases and equipment repair. A special analysis is required of the regulatory framework for applying the directive through the lens of the 1936 Red Army Field Manual, known as PU-36, and the draft 1939 Field Manual. Neither of these documents envisioned the total destruction of one's own civilian infrastructure along with the population residing there. Chapter 10 of the PU-36 Manual, regulating actions in defense and retreat, required the evacuation of material assets and the destruction of bridges, railway junctions, and port facilities. Regarding populated areas, the manual prescribed adapting them for defense, creating fortified centers of resistance. Directive 0428 effectively repealed these articles of the manual, replacing the engineering preparation of the terrain with its destruction. At the same time, no mechanism for the organized evacuation of the civilian population was created. The speed of advance of German motorized columns in October and early November 1941 ranged from 20 to 30 kilometers per day, which precluded the possibility of a planned withdrawal of hundreds of thousands of peasants from the zones designated for burning. The implementation of the directive on the ground often led to a breakdown in command and conflicts between various agencies. A report dated December 5, 1941, by the head of the Special Department of the NKVD of the Western Front, Senior Major of State Security Lavrenti Tsanava, noted cases of armed clashes between members of destruction battalions and local residents attempting to protect their homes from arson. In the village of Ustye, in the Naro-Fominsk district, local residents disarmed a group of soldiers from the 201st Airborne Brigade who were trying to set fire to the outermost huts. The situation was exacerbated by the fact that the German command used the Soviet directive for propaganda purposes. On the orders of the commander of the 4th Panzer Group, Colonel General Erich Hopner, in whose operational zone villages of the Istra district were being destroyed, leaflets with the text of Directive 0428 were posted in surviving settlements. This intensified anti-Soviet sentiments among part of the population and pushed them to form self-defense units coordinated by German commandants' offices. Let us consider the logistical and technical aspects of the German countermeasures against the scorched earth tactics. The command of Army Group Center quickly recognized the threat of being deprived of winter quarters and implemented a set of measures, recorded in the Rear Area Order of November 22, 1941. Firstly, a curfew was imposed in all major settlements within a 50-kilometer radius of the front line. Round-the-clock combat security posts were deployed, consisting of units from the field gendarmerie and SS security battalions. Around villages, at a distance of 200 to 300 meters from the outermost buildings, shrubs were cleared to ensure clear fields of fire, and the approaches were mined with pressure-activated anti-personnel mines with tripwire fuses. Secondly, the German troops altered their quartering structure. Instead of housing entire companies in wooden huts, soldiers were dispersed among stone buildings, schools, churches, and brick factories, which had high fire resistance. In the event of a house being burned, German soldiers would drive the civilian population out of surviving cellars, dugouts, and earth shelters, occupying these underground shelters themselves. As a result, the majority of German personnel remained in warmth, while civilians were left out in the open at temperatures below -20 degrees Celsius. Thus, the Soviet command's expectation of mass freezing of German soldiers was only partially realized. The Wehrmacht's greatest losses from the cold were not in their quarters, but during marches, and directly at their positions due to a lack of warm clothing. A statistical assessment of the consequences of implementing Directive 0428 was compiled after the conclusion of the Battle of Moscow in the spring of 1942. According to the consolidated report of the Moscow Regional Executive Committee and the Extraordinary State Commission for the Establishment and Investigation of the Atrocities of the German Fascist Invaders, in the territory of 24 liberated districts of the Moscow region, 2,280 villages and hamlets were completely or partially destroyed. The total number of destroyed residential houses amounted to 91,200 units. Approximately 250,000 civilians were left homeless. In the territories of the Kalinin, Tula, and Smolensk regions, which fell within the scope of the directive, about 65,000 additional rural buildings were destroyed. Assessing the demographic losses among the civilian population deprived of shelter in the winter of 1941 in precise numbers is extremely difficult due to the absence of comprehensive administrative records in the frontline zone. According to estimates by district health departments made in March 1942, mortality among the peaceful population in the burned areas from hypothermia, exhaustion, and accompanying infectious diseases such as typhus increased threefold compared to the same period in 1940. The highest mortality rates were recorded among children under 12 years of age and persons over 60. From the perspective of its impact on the enemy's logistical base, Directive 0428 made a certain contribution to disrupting the general offensive against Moscow. But the price of this contribution proved disproportionate to the tactical results achieved. The destruction of part of the housing stock forced the Wehrmacht command to narrow its offensive front, tying the movement of divisions exclusively to major roads and surviving towns such as Klin, Solnechnogorsk, Volokolamsk, and Narofominsk. This facilitated the organization of anti-tank defense by the Soviet command, as the directions of enemy attacks became easily predictable. The density of German combat formations increased, making them more vulnerable to strikes from Soviet heavy artillery and assault aircraft. However, this positive factor for the Red Army was completely negated by subsequent difficulties during its own offensive, when Soviet soldiers arrived on the scorched earth and lost the opportunity to recuperate in warmth. Internal documents of the General Staff of the Red Army indicate the gradual rollback of the strict requirements of Directive 0428 as the strategic initiative changed. As early as November 24, 1941, Zhukov signed Order Number 04118, which somewhat adjusted the implementation of Stalin's directive. This document prohibited division commanders from indiscriminately burning all populated areas in succession without considering specific tactical expediency. It was prescribed to destroy only those buildings where the location of enemy headquarters, communication centers, supply trains, or firing positions had been reliably established. Artillery fire was to become pinpoint, not area-based. By January 1942, when the front line had moved 100 to 250 kilometers away from Moscow, Directive 0428 had effectively lost its force, as Soviet troops entered territory where the preservation of housing stock was critically important for providing shelter to the advancing armies and restoring Soviet government bodies. Drawing a dry summary, it can be stated that the directive of the Supreme High Command Headquarters Number 0428 was a product of a critical period of the war when the military leadership made decisions based on the concept of total war, where the material destruction of the enemy's habitat was recognized as a more important factor than preserving the livelihoods of its own population. The cold logic of military pragmatism viewed 250,000 Soviet peasants not as citizens of the state, but as a resource element of the territory that needed to be removed to weaken the Wehrmacht's offensive potential. The effectiveness of this measure proved limited due to the engineering ability of German troops to adapt to changing conditions and by shifting the burden of the consequences onto civilians. The destruction of villages and hamlets dealt a severe economic blow to the agricultural sector of the central regions of the RSFSR, eliminating the fixed assets of collective farms, seed grain reserves, and livestock, which affected the region's food supply until 1945. This concludes the detailed historical and archival analysis of Directive 0428. Thank you for your attention, subscribe to the channel, and see you in the next episodes.